Who knows at what cost? In any event, they had lost a son during the White House, Willie. His death had completely undone Mary. She spent all her days weeping, consulting spiritualists so she could communicate with him in the grave, bursting out in embarrassing fashion. It's not good to have a first lady in public lose it, but she did frequently. On this day, Lincoln tried to rouse her, spoke about returning home to Springfield, Illinois. Mary, you've got to try to be happy now, he said. Our future is ahead of us. It was, of course, a brief future. He died that night. The death of that president, the fact that it came after the conclusion of this war, oh, Captain, my Captain, said Walt Whitman in his poem, eulogizing Lincoln after his death. All of these things transformed Lincoln into the figure he still is in our imagination today, into a kind of martyr. A funeral cortege carrying the body, train, embarked on a 2-week, 17-day drive, retracing the journey from Springfield that Lincoln had taken 4 years earlier when he had come from Springfield to assume the presidency. Hundreds of thousands of people turned out to see him, to witness the cortege. I think I have a picture. That's actually the funeral train. The travail of Lincoln was over. The travail of the 4 million men, women, and children who were now free was just beginning. This was the problem of Reconstruction. This has long been, in some fashion remains, one of the most contentious periods of American history. A period of tremendous political conflict, tumult, and violence. The vast majority of it directed against the formerly enslaved and their political allies. It also represented, for a brief time, the most extraordinary experiment in democracy that this nation, or any nation, has ever attempted. In the decade after the end of the Civil War, black people would enjoy rights of equal citizenship. They would even acquire the right to vote. At least black men would, because we need to continue to remember that we're talking about a period in which the ballot was, in most states, restricted to men. This experiment would not last long. Through the first half of the 1870s, one southern state after another was redeemed. This was the term that was used at the time, and it's still the term in your textbook. Southern redemption. Restoring white supremacy. This period culminated in 1876 when a hung presidential election. Disputes over who had won the election in 3 southern states, including, inevitably, Florida, who would get the electoral votes of Florida, issued in a political compromise in which the Republicans were allowed to continue in the White House in exchange for withdrawing the last federal troops from the South and ending the experiment of Reconstruction. The result would be nearly a century, some 90 years, of legal inequality for black people in the South, which would finally only be overthrown in the civil rights era of the 1950s and 60s. And I want to underscore how remarkable this period is. You know, one of the things we talked about last year, slavery is not unusual in human history. In fact, far more unusual in our societies that don't or didn't have some system of slavery, at least for the last 200 years or so. If you look at the history of slave societies and societies with slaves across the span of human history, you will find one in which the formerly enslaved people were enfranchised as citizens and allowed to participate directly in the political struggles that would determine their future. That's this one. It's the only one. And even here, that experiment lasted for a very short time. But it's really worth keeping in mind. We're going to talk next year a lot about the Civil Rights Act. We're going to talk a lot about what happened, I mean, literally on the ground on which we stand. And yet it's worth keeping in mind the main things that were being struggled for, at least some of the things that were being struggled for in that era. The right to access to public accommodation would finally come with the 1964 Civil Rights Act. The right to vote, the centerpiece of the Mississippi struggle, which would finally be accomplished in the 1965 Voting Rights Act. Those were privileges that black people had in fact enjoyed a century before. All right. Given how tragic this period would end up, many historians have pondered what you might call the counterfactual. What if? Well, as a historian, I hate counterfactuals. You know, what if Napoleon had the atomic bomb at Waterloo? Well, you know, that's just not what happened. Why are we having this conversation? And yet, in this particular case, it's rather interesting. What would have happened had Lincoln lived? Did Lincoln have plans for Reconstruction? Might this great father who had saved the Union have somehow allowed the nation to navigate the Reconstruction era in a less divisive and disastrous way? Well, there is some evidence about what Lincoln might have tried. In December 1863, he in fact offered a plan for restoring southern states that had seceded to the Union. He called it his 10% plan. It basically decreed that a state could re-enter the Union when 10% of the total number of voters in 1860 took an oath, pledging first their allegiance to the United States, and second, their allegiance to emancipation. Once this was done, they could elect a state government, they could write a new state constitution, a state constitution Lincoln stipulated that would abolish slavery forever. At that point, he pledged to recognize those states, and those states would effectively be reconstructed. And this is basically what happened in some of the first states to have been conquered by Union troops: Louisiana, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Some have portrayed this as evidence of Lincoln's great magnanimity, his compassion. He would have been more conciliatory in his treatment of the South than the other radicals in the Republican Party. Maybe, but it was also clearly strategic. Lincoln was deeply, deeply concerned that emancipation wouldn't stick. Not a foregone, just because you wrote this thing on a piece of paper doesn't mean it's going to happen. And so a lot of his efforts were designed, he also knew, look, that the Emancipation Proclamation was going to antagonize a lot of skeptical whites, and not just in the South, perhaps leading to a Democratic victory in the election of 1864. So part of what he's trying to do is try to figure out, how do you actually make emancipation permanent? And if you could start readmitting southern states with constitutions that have abolished slavery, that would be a great step forward. One of the other things Lincoln does, by the way, is he forwards to Congress and then to the states a 13th Amendment to the Constitution, abolishing slavery. He knows that the Emancipation Proclamation alone would do it. So he sends to the states, and that's the 13th Amendment would, of course, eventually be ratified after Lincoln's death, after the war, December 1865. Lincoln's 10% plan did not insist on black enfranchisement. Though in a letter from the period, written as I recall to a Louisianian, which is one of the places where they were trying the 10% plan, that it would be good for the state to make provision for voting by at least some of the free people, including those troops who had served in the Union Army and keep in mind, by the end of the war, about 10% of the Union Army was black, mostly former slaves. And also, in his words, the extraordinarily or unusually intelligent. Lincoln's lenient Reconstruction plan, if that's what it was, encountered strong opposition from more radical groups within his own Republican Party. Two of those radicals, Senator Benjamin Wade of Ohio and Representative Henry Davis of Maryland, devised their own plan, the so-called Wade-Davis bill. According to the Wade-Davis bill, and here's the bill, and here's Wade and Davis, for a state to be readmitted to the Union would require not just an oath by 10% of the voting population, but a majority of voters in all southern states.